Hello and welcome to today's class. In this class we're talking about seam finishes. So seam finishes are all the seams inside the garment you see that are properly done to prevent the edges of your fabric from fraying. It also keeps your garment very clean and tidy inside, and it makes your seams last longer. So those are seam finishes, and there are different types of them. Usually you see the complicated seam finishes in high-end garments, and in the high street garment you only see the overcast seam finish. The overcast seam finish is when you use an overlock machine to finish off the edge of your seams. You can also have them use a zigzag finish. So I'll talk about all of that. I don't have the pinking shares now. I have it in the workshop, but I'll be able to talk about what a pinking shares is for you to see. I also do not have an overcast machine with me now, because our overcast machine, as you know, with COVID and all protocols governing COVID, our overcast machine is also locked in the workshop. So I'm working from home now doing the video for you, and hopefully I'll be able to talk about the overcast. But the overcast seam finish is what you would see in most of the garments you wear. That is what they call the overlocked edge or overcast edge. It means the same, it's one and the same. It means the same. Overlock, overcast is one and the same. I'm going to explain to you about your seam allowance, what it means when people say seam allowance. Now, seam allowance is from the raw edge of your fabric to where you run your first stitch. So this is my stitch line. So this here is my seam allowance. The distance from my raw edge to where I run my stitch line is called the seam allowance. And usually in commercial patterns, the seam allowance they usually leave is 5/8. But seriously, sometimes you may not be able to gauge a 5/8 properly. So when you're doing it on your own, I will say go for half of an inch. Half of an inch is also good. If you can just get half of an inch seam allowance, in most cases half of an inch is as good as 5/8. But if you want a 5/8, then definitely do go for 5/8. So half of an inch is from here to here, you know, because this is an inch. From here to here is 1 inch, so half of an inch is here. A quarter of an inch is here. So between half of an inch, the other line, longest line between them, that is a quarter of an inch. 1/8 of an inch is from 1 inch. The next immediate line, like the immediate line close to 1 inch marking, is 1/8 of an inch. So I'll be talking about half an inch, quarter of an inch, 1/8. You just should know where to place them. So for the sake of you watching, let me go back again. So this is 1 inch. I would say from here to here is 1 inch, but because of this metal bit, I just want to start my 1 inch from here to here. So this is 1 inch, and this here, the half of it is half of an inch. So from here to here is half of an inch. Now from here to here is a quarter of an inch. From here to here is a quarter of an inch. From here to here is 1/8 of an inch. So if you want 5/8 of an inch, 5/8 of an inch is from here to, so this is 5/8 of an inch. From here to here is 5/8 of an inch. From here to here is 5/8 of an inch. So you go beyond a half of an inch a little bit. So after half of an inch, the next line, that is 5/8 of an inch, and usually that is a commercial pattern people leave. You can leave, you know, that or half of an inch or whatever works for you. Really, you can just leave it. If you are not too sure, you can start measuring your 5/8 of an inch. So exactly there I have it, 5/8 of an inch. That is what the commercial patterns will give us, 5/8 of an inch. You can just measure it throughout and use your tailor's chalk. So that's the tailor's chalk. If you are working with me for the first time and you don't know what a tailor's chalk is, that is a tailor's chalk. It's used in making markings as we stitch in our garment, and this usually comes off. For some tailor's chalk, it comes off once you've done your first wash. Others, when you iron the mark, it disappears. So it depends on what tailor's chalk you're using. You have to be looking for the qualities when you're buying it. So as I've explained, from here the edge, the raw edge of your garment to where you run your stitch line is called the seam allowance. So I'm doing a 5/8 seam allowance. Our first seam finish is going to be the pinked edge finish, and this is used on stable fabrics. So fabrics that do not fray too much, like this cotton fabric that does not fray too much, you just use your pinked edge finish. So it's used on stable fabrics that does not fray easily when it's used, and it's usually used on articles or garments that are not going to be washed too much. So garments that you're not going to wash too much, you can use this kind of finish for it. And for the pink edge finish, you just use a pinking shears to cut off the raw edge, so you have the raw edge not looking straight like this but zigzag. So I'm going to start my stitch, and as usual I'm going to back up my stitch. Backing up your stitch is when you secure the ends, the beginning and ends of your stitch, so that they don't fray. So I'll do about 2-3 stitches forward, 2-3 stitches backwards, stop, and then press on my reverse lever, and then go backwards and then forwards again, and then I'll carry my stitches. So you saw me do my reverse front, forward and backward stitch here to secure it. I carried on, and when I got to the tail end, I also did a forward and backward stitch here to secure it. If I, at this point, if I have a pinking shears, a pinking shears is just like a scissors, but instead of a straight edge here, it's got a zigzag edge. So when you cut in your fabric, it leaves a zigzag edge, and what the zigzag edge does is it prevents the edges of your fabric from fraying. So that is the first one, our pinked edge. Now I'm going to talk about the zigzag edge. So for the zigzag edge too, you put the right side of fabrics together. So I'll say right on right. When I say right on right, that means that you're putting right sides of your fabrics together. So we are stitching on the wrong side of the fabric. In the same way, I'll be using a 5/8 stitch allowance. You can always draw in your stitch allowance so that you know exactly how or where you are running your stitch if you are not too comfortable with it. If you think you can gauge it with your eye as well, why not just do that, you know. But for the sake of demonstration, I'll just draw in my stitch allowance, and then I'll carry on from there. So the zigzag edge is also used on any type of fabric except the sheer fabric, so, and delicate fabric. So except your satins, your organzas, and your silk and all the sheer fabrics. So apart from the shears and the delicate fabrics, you can use them on any type of fabric at all. First, you have to put in your seam 5/8, just like we did. Put two fabrics together, right on right, and then we stitch on the wrong side. I first back my stitch, so I'll do first 2 stitches, you know, and then I'll go back and forward, then I carry on stitching. So like you saw in the video, I did a forward and a backward stitch at my beginning and the end. It's always very, very necessary to do that. This is where you are going to be touching your stitch length. You know, you're going to touch your stitch length. So for this, the smaller stitch length sorry, it will be for the lighter fabrics, and then the higher stitch length will be for your heavy fabric. So this is it. You know, I'm going to be touching my stitch length here, so I'll be putting my stitch length to about 3, and then I will put my stitch pattern to a zigzag stitch. You get it? You can always do a test on a swatch fabric before you actually attempt it on the main fabric, just so that you are sure of what you're doing. I'm touching my width, I'm touching my stitch dial, and I'm touching my pattern dial for the zigzag edge finish. I'm going to do a test stitch now and see if I'm happy with my stitch. So I had turned my stitch dial to 1. Okay, it's about 1.2, so between 1 and 2, that is the stitch length, where my stitch length is. I've moved it from the usual 2.5 to about 1.2, and my stitch width, which is on top here, that is 3, just about 3.2 as well. So the stitch width is around 3.2, my stitch length is 1.2, and my pattern length is on the zigzag. So that is what I am going to do. The next thing is I can choose to put both of my edges together like this and run my zigzag edge here, or I can part it open and do them separately. And at this point I will prefer to do them separately, because in that way the fabric is not, the seam finish or the edge finish is not too bulky. So the ideal thing is to open your seam up and press it down with an iron, but this fabric seems to conform easily with my fingers as I press it down, so I'll get away with using an iron to press it down and just carry on doing my edge finish now. So I'm just going to be running it at the edge of the garment, of the fabrics, sorry. So I'll catch it at the edge and you see it in a minute how to do it. So that is it, zigzag edge finish. You do that with your machine. Never use a different fabric and a different thread in finishing the edges, unless of course it's meant to be a design. But I've only used a black thread against this off-white fabric because I want you to be able to see what I'm doing. So like I said, the zigzag edge is done on any type of fabric at all, except the sheer fabrics and the delicate fabrics. And if you are doing it on cotton, polycotton or linen fabrics, you use smaller stitch length. So the stitch length that I used for this is 1, and then my width is 3.2, and I put it on a zigzag, and my tension still remained at 4. I didn't change my tension. But in case I was doing this edge finish on denims or upholstery fabric or on a canvas, then I'll probably be going to a higher stitch length of about 3, 2, 3 or 4, higher stitch length, depending on which one is suitable for me. So you just need to keep testing. But what you need to keep in mind is that when the fabric is a medium weight, like a cotton, a polycotton or a linen fabric, you're going to be choosing a lower stitch length, and your width should also be lower, around 3.2 thereabout, and your stitch length should be at 1. So those are the few changes you just need to note, and that is it for the zigzag edge finish. The next edge finish I would like to talk about is the pressed edge or clean edge finish. So for the pressed edge finish or the clean edge finish, I've reversed back to my usual settings for general stitching. So I've gone back to my 2.5 stitch length, I've gone back to my straight stitching, I've moved it from zigzag to straight stitching, I've put my width back to 0, and my tension is still on 4. And I'm going to start stitching now. I'm going to back my stitch here because I'm doing a straight stitch. So from the beginning of my stitch I have to back it, and when I'm ending too, I'm going to back it to secure my stitch. So let's carry on. A few stitches forward, and then a few stitches backwards, and then I'm going to carry on. So the pressed edge stitch is used on medium to lightweight fabrics. So you can use them on your cottons, on your polycottons, on your linens. You can use them all on it. And when you're starting it, you put the right side of the fabrics together. So I'll say right on right. So this is the right side of my fabrics. I put the right side and the right side of the fabrics together, and then I stitch on the wrong side of the fabric. And when I've done that, I'm going to open my seam allowance up like that, you know, with the help of an iron. Just press the seam allowance open, you know. But this fabric I'm using is a cotton fabric, and it seems to conform easily to my press, and also I just use my fingernails to press it, just so that I don't have to move away from the machine with that and go and use an iron and come back, and I can work quickly that way. So the pressed stitch, you press it open, and what we do next is I take one side of my edge like that and then fold it, you know, backwards about 1/8 of an inch, about 1/8 of an inch like this. So I'm going to fold it for you to see with the help of my pins. As you can see, I've pinned the raw edges all down. I've pinned the raw edges all down from the, you can see from the back. So I'm going to run a stitch at the edge here, all the way round, down and all the way around, just lifting it up. So I'm not going to put it on this, on the main body of the fabric, like on the main body of the garment or the fabric. I'm just going to lift it up like this, okay, like this, and just stitch it without it touching the main body. So I'll stitch half of it, if you can see me, if you can see it like this, you know. So I'm stitching one side. When I finish, I'll flip it over and stitch the other side. There we are. This is the pressed edge stitch. So as you can see, I did a little fold at the edge here, and then I ran my stitch on it. I did not run the stitch together with the body of the fabric. I just lifted it up and ran a stitch on this side and ran a stitch on this side. So I'll just press my iron. I'll use my iron to press it open and flat, and that is it for the pressed edge seam finish. Our next seam finish will be the French seam finish, and that is usually done on lightweight fabrics, on sheer fabrics, on delicate fabrics. That is where you see the French seam finish. This is so because the French seam finish is a bulky seam finish, so when you do it on a heavy fabric, it makes it too bulky and it will be showing in the garment, and we don't want that. So we do them on lighter fabrics. And for this one, we put the wrong sides together. You realize that for most of the seam finishes, we were putting the right sides together. So the wrong side of the fabric is what comes together, and then we'll be stitching on the right side. This is quite different. So but it's a beautiful edge finish. If you ask me, I really like it, and it's a beautiful edge finish. Just pay close attention to it, and then you will get it. So we put the wrong sides of the fabric together. So this is my wrong side of my fabric, and this is my right side. We'll be stitching on the right side, and I'm going to be stitching first 1/4 of an inch, and I showed you what 1/4 of an inch was on the tape measure. We'll stitch 1/4 of an inch, and after I finish stitching 1/4 of an inch, I'm going to grade it down to 1/8 of an inch, and I'll show you what it means to grade down. Grading down is just like cutting off some of the inches to make it a bit shorter. That is all it means. But these are terms in tailoring, so when you get to know what it is, then when you hear it, you don't get confused or you don't panic, because you actually know what it means. So 1/4 of an inch, I don't have 1/4 of an inch marking here, but 1/4 of an inch will be about here, because I do it all the time, so I know what 1/4 of an inch will be. So it will be about here, you know. So I'll be stitching to about this side, if you can see it here, just here. And when I finish, I'm going to cut this into 2. So that is what it means by grading down. So as usual, I'm going to do my back stitch to secure my stitch. So I'll do a few stitches forward and a few stitches backwards to secure it. Remember, we put the wrong sides together and we stitched on the right side. So I'm going to grade it down, and I said I was going to show you what it means to grade down. So I'm going to cut very close to my stitch line. That is what it means to grade down. So you can see it. You can see it. I've cut very close to my stitch line. I'm going to cut all this off, and I'll show you the reason why I had to cut all that off, to grade it very close to my stitch line. I've graded my stitch seam allowance down to 1/8. So you first stitch at 1/4 of an inch, then when you've done that, you grade it to 1/8, Then you turn it over. This is it. I did my stitch on the right side of the fabric, and then I graded it down. You can see it, I graded it down, and I'm going to flip my fabric over like that. So I'm going to have this, and at this point this is where an iron comes in handy. I'm going to be stitching at 3/8 of a seam allowance, or if 3/8 is difficult for you to guess, you can go for 1/4 of an inch. So I've just done that, 1/4 of an inch. I'm going to stitch it now. So that is it. We have it. So this is the right side, and then this is the wrong side. So the next seam finish I'm going to work on is called the flat feld. And this seam finish is used on garments that is going to see a lot of stress. So you can see it in the inner thigh of your jeans, trousers, or on shirts. So on areas where there's a lot of friction, you use that particular seam finish. For this, you put the right side of the fabrics together, and then you sew at 5/8 of a seam allowance. Now it doesn't end there. When you're done, you iron it open, or you just press it open. You're going to grade one side of your seam allowance down to about 1/4 of an inch. So I'm going to be cutting that off. So let's say this is 1/4 of an inch. I'm going to be cutting this off. Okay, so after cutting it off, I'm going to wrap the other half of the seam allowance around this one. I'm going to wrap it around this one here. Open this up and stitch it down. So this is what it's going to look like. I'll get some pins to pin it down. So I'll use the bigger side of the seam allowance to wrap around the smaller one, and then stitch it down. So this is it. I've pinned them in place. I'm going to get my machine and run a stitch very close to the edge of the seam. I guess you've seen this seam finish in the inside of your jeans, trousers, or in the inside of your shirt, especially for the men. You may have seen this inside somewhere. So that is it. Our next one will be the mocked edge finish. The mocked edge finish is quite similar to the French seam finish, but it is done differently. So we'll do that, and then you have a look at it as well. So for the mock edge, you put the right sides of the fabrics together, and then you stitch on the wrong side, and we are stitching at 5/8. I finished stitching at 5/8. You press your seam allowance opened, and then you fold one side in. You fold about 1/4 inch in on one side, and you do the same on the other side. So 1/4 on this side and 1/4 on this side as well, and then you bring both ends together like that. You put your pins in, and then you stitch very close to the edge. So you see that it looks quite like the French seam, but this has a stitch at the edge. So there it is. I folded both ends in. You can see, as you can see, I folded both ends in, and I've pinned it. I'm going to stitch very close to the edge. So that is the mock edge finish for that. Our next one will be the Hong Kong finish, and this one is seen in jackets a lot. So let's see how it's done. Okay, so let me explain how to do the Hong Kong finish. The Hong Kong finish, you start with your put the right sides of the fabric together. So you'll be stitching on the wrong side, and you'll be stitching at 1/8 of a seam allowance. So you do your seam allowance. I'll go back to the machine and do that and come back. Then you finish the edge of your seam allowance. So you'll be finishing the edge here and here with a bias strip. I want to explain how to get a bias strip. So you can either get a bias strip, a bought one, or if you are doing a garment and you want to match it with your own fabrics, then you get your own bias strips made. So in weaving of fabrics, there is the weft and the warp. So you see the crosswise and the weftwise, and that is how you get fabrics woven. So there is the threads going across and the ones coming vertical, and those are the warp and the weft. And in that way, the fabric that don't have a stretch that way. But when you take the fabric diagonally, then there is a stretch, and it is at that point that we want to get our bias. So that's how to get a bias strip. A bias strip is when you cut a strip diagonally instead of across, like the cross grains. We don't cut the cross grains because the cross grains hasn't got a stretch. But when you cut them diagonally, you get a stretch that way. So you only have to hold them at the corners, and then you start cutting. So I'll cut my first strip. I'll cut about 2 of them because I'm going to be finishing 2 edges. And then when I go to the machine, you get to see. So I'm cutting about 1 inch of a strip. And this is what I'm going to use to finish the edges of my seam. So let's go to the machine. Still on the Hong Kong finish, I'm just going to sew in my 5/8 seam at my 5/8 seam allowance. I'm going to open up my seam allowance and then finish off the edges of my seams. So with my bias strip like this, I'm going to be placing the right side of my bias strip. So you can see that the pattern side is on the right side. I'm placing the right side of my bias strip on the right side of my seam allowance. So right on right. Okay, and I'm going to pin it all through. Then I run a stitch of about 1/4 of an inch. About 1/4 of an inch. So when you cut at on a bias, it gives you a stretch. And the reason why I had to cut on the bias is this happens to be, I'm just finishing a straight edge, but if you happen to be using this seam finish around the armhole area, because that area is curved, then you need a bias strip to be able to lay your the edge of your seam with it easily because of the stretch. But this is straight. You can get away with just a normal cut, but the appropriate one is to cut on a bias strip. So I'm going to run a stitch here at 1/4 of an inch, turn it over and wrap my raw edge with the bias strip like this, and then stitch on it again. So I'm going to do my first stitch and come back for you to see. So I finished stitching my bias strip on the raw edge. I'm going to wrap it around the raw edge like that, and then run another stitch over here very close to the edge. So you wrap your raw edge, as you can see, you turn it over and wrap your raw edge with your bias strip. Don't be worried about the excess fabric here. You can always grade it down when you finish stitching. Okay, and if you think wrapping around is a bit difficult, you can always use your iron, and your iron makes it easier. So there it is. I've wrapped it around them, just put pins in it. I'm going to run a stitch just on this side, and then I'll turn it around and grade it down and come back for you. Okay, so that's one edge finish. I'm going to do the same, repeat the same process on this raw edge here. So when you turn the back, you can see this fabric. If you think the fabric is too much, you can always cut the excesses off. So you can just grade it down. And this is a really beautiful edge. It's usually seen on high-end garments and on jackets and areas where there's a lot of friction and abrasion in the garment. Those are the areas you see it. So I've done it on one end here. As you can see, I'm going to repeat the same process on the other end. So the right side of the fabric here, on the right side of your seam allowance. So right on right, you pin it, run a 1/4 of an inch stitch, turn it over to wrap it around the raw edge, and then you do it. I'm going to finish it and then bring it back here. So that is it. Hong Kong seam finished off with a bias strip. We've come to the end of our seam finishing session. I hope you enjoyed this workshop. If you did, please give our video a thumbs up, like and share, and hope to see you again in our next class. Have a lovely day. Bye.